Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm really honoured to give you a very warm Geneva welcome to this event this evening, where we launch our long-awaited study, Roots of Restraint. Now, everyone in this room, I am sure, are very aware of the ICRC's specific role in being the guardians of international humanitarian law, and also our humanitarian mandate to reduce suffering during times of armed conflict. And I see many familiar faces of people who have been to events on this topic. But that is very much focusing on the what. And today we've got the pleasure to focus on the how. How do we identify better ways of fostering respect for the rule of law and in general restraint during times of armed conflict and other situations of violence at the strategic, operational and tactical level? Tonight we have a treat. We have a number of experts, two particular experts who have spent, I would say, the last couple of years working very hard on this, sleeping, eating, dreaming it at a certain point. And they're going to be able to unpack these issues about how we really get traction in this space. The report itself is based on 2 years of academic study, and it updates a previous report the ICRC had done in 2004 called Roots of Behaviour in War. And I think one of the things that will be interesting to reflect with you upon tonight is the areas that that report confirmed in our current update, but also the areas it's challenged. And we in ICRC really like a good challenge, and we're going to engage with a few tonight. But before I go any further, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and it's the Vice President of the ICRC, Professor Gilles Carbonnet, and he's going to set the scene for us. So I'd invite you, Gilles, if you'd like to come up to this informal podium and set the scene.
I think that, as Helen was mentioning, this study addresses issues and questions of critical relevance to us, the International Committee of the Red Cross, as guardian and promoter of the international humanitarian law, but also I think issues of critical importance to states signatory to the Geneva Conventions and more broadly to the humanitarian sector writ large. These are questions, as Helen mentioned, which go to the heart of what explains that in some instances arms carriers, be they in formal military structures or in non-state armed groups, exert restraint in the exercise of violence, do actually abide by international humanitarian law and do not commit violations. So these questions, how best to ensure the proper enforcement of the laws of war, how best to influence the behavior of often young men's armed carriers, both in regular military forces and non-state armed groups, so that they refrain from committing war crimes, serious violations is key. This study that we launched today brings essential additions to the previous study that had been conducted 15 years back that Helen mentioned, the Roots of Behavior in War. That initial study had highlighted the importance of making sure that the rules of principle of IHL are not only widely known, disseminated, but they are also integrated in training curricula, and they are integrated in formal mechanisms of sanctions. The focus was clearly on formal mechanisms, and the focus was also with reference to relatively centralized organizations. We focused primarily on legal arguments rather than on individual or groups' values and identity. Since then, of course, we have seen a multiplication of non-state armed groups, and often groups that are rather decentralized or actually highly embedded in communities. So it is high time to update, expand the evidence that we have to inform our action. This is why I'm particularly glad to welcome the launch of this study, The Roots of Restraint in War. This study approaches armed forces and non-state armed groups according their level of institutionalization or actually of organizational structure all the way from integrated state armed forces to community-embedded armed groups. I wish to commend the authors of the study for focusing on cases where combatants exerted restraint in the use of force. Through case studies, the study tries to understand what explains compliance with IHL, instead of focusing, as usual, on blatant violation and trying to explain patterns of abuse. The study that we are launching today also illustrates the potential of productive collaboration between academics and the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I think more broadly, the huge potential of productive relationship between applied research and humanitarian practice. I wish to commend in particular those who led the study, Dr. Fiona Terry and Dr. Brian McQueen, for methodological rigor and ethical concerns. And I had the chance actually to witness this firsthand by being associated with the ethical review board of the project and see how the project had evolved. And I had also the chance to have very rich exchanges with individual researchers who were involved in conducting the case studies in the field. The report that we launched today confirms that the behavior of armed forces and groups is indeed influenced by legal considerations, formal training, and sanction mechanisms, but not only. It is also influenced by informal mechanisms that involve group peer pressure and the actual socialization of norms, which is a process closely associated with shared values and identity. The study further shows that outsiders, such as the ICRC, and local communities as well, do influence the behavior of those fighting, for instance, in non-state armed groups. Therefore, criminalizing contacts with such non-state armed groups is counterproductive to efforts aimed at curbing excess in warfare. This report provides important food for thought to sustain one of the ICRC top strategic priority, how to influence the behavior of those conducting the hostilities, to ensure greater respect for IHL, to prevent violations, and to better protect civilians, prisoners, and people injured in war. The findings, ladies and gentlemen, in my view, open several avenues for further research. In my mind, it is worth tapping into recent advances in cognitive and behavioral sciences. Since the turn of the millennium, we have seen very big advances also in my own discipline, economics, where behavioral economists have shown actually several pathways that are very powerful in influencing the behavior of different people, be they consumers or investors. And indeed, I think in the domain of marketing and investment, a lot of thought has been given to it, but not yet so much in the field of humanitarian action, and I think that we have a lot to tap into in order to strengthen our capacity to influence behavior. Another domain that also calls for further research and engagement is to deal more broadly and forcefully with youth. By the time young people join the army or the armed groups, I think the study shows that these young people had already many opportunities to get socialized with regard to the limits in the exercise of armed violence. How can we devise innovative ways to infuse notions of a shared humanity and of restraint in the exercise of violence in the midst of war? This is also a domain worth exploring more in depth, with a great potential in relation to the ongoing digital transformation and means. Ladies and gentlemen, this study is the product of an intensive collective endeavor, and I wish to thank and start by the UK aid agency DFID for contributing to the funding and supporting of the study. I wish to thank also the ICRC delegations in countries where the case studies were carried out: Australia, Colombia, Mali, the Philippines, and South Sudan. Let me also extend words of appreciation to the academics with whom we collaborated, and in particular those who conducted the case studies: Andrew Bell, Francisco Gutierrez Sanin, Yvon Gishawa, Ferdaus Bouhlel, Naomi Penden, and Oliver Kaplan. And again, Fiona Terry and Brian McQueen for leading the project, as well as Ben Eckstein. I wish to thank also the members of the steering committee and my colleagues of the Ethical Review Board, and the many others who supported the research, production, and editing of the report that is being launched this evening. I wish now to give the floor back to Helen Duran and trust that the report will stimulate thought-provoking exchanges between all of us this evening. Thank you.
As our Vice President expressed, I think it's demonstrated a number of things that we in the ICRC, and I know the wider world, are really looking at. Looking at the need to have strong evidence base in our decision-making and the ways that we implement policy. And I think the need to have partnerships and make sure that we challenge ourselves constantly. Now, based actually on the journey that we've gone on in the last few years, and I must say to Difford, it's been a number of years, so thank you for your patience to understand that these things are not done swiftly if they're done properly. But based on that journey, earlier this year, the ICRC established CORE, which is the Centre of Operational Research and Experience, and which Fiona Terry leads. And I think going forward, it'll be really exciting to see how we capture what happens on the ground and connect it with our intellectual reflections, really combining the experience with the expertise and getting evidence. But I also wanted to spend a few moments, because the launch of this takes me back to many years ago, 15 years ago, when I was a delegate in the field in the Pacific. And I really clearly remember when you're way off, far away from Geneva, and you've got a task to get a state such as Papua New Guinea to learn about international humanitarian law. It's sometimes very hard to take these very important but very big books and put them down in front of chiefs. And I had this experience with the Vice President of Tonga, and he was a gentleman with all the huge tattoos and the grass dress. And after I'd given a presentation in those days, not just on a PowerPoint, but on an overhead projector, he took me aside, he said, "Listen, Dr. Hallen, that's really nice, but Geneva, that's where they have lots of chocolate. You know, tell us something that speaks to our heart. Tell us a way that we can interpret and put this into practice that moves from the mind to the heart." And back in those days, in the early 2000s, I started a research project with students at the university in Vanuatu from the 12 or 16 Pacific countries, asking them to find myths and stories and connections that we could have an entry point to talk about IHL, rather than starting with the story of Henry Dunant, even though we love that story. Everyone has myths and stories. And I just, as an aside, I remember the first time one of the students rang up, very excited, from up in the hills in Papua New Guinea, and he said, Helen, I found an example in our traditional culture of limitations of conflict that you talk about. I said, great. He said, we have a saying, never eat the face of someone you know. And I would sort of, respectful treatment of the remains of the dead, I sort of couldn't fit it all in. And I realised that there are also things we have to be careful of, the cut and pasting of culture. We can't cut and paste things and actually then create a narrative. We have to be authentic. And I must admit, in a number of the answers that we've had in this project, as Director of International Law and Policy, I'm really relieved. Us lawyers, we don't like to ask questions we don't know the answer to. So the fact that it confirmed that training is important, I felt very relieved, but we'll hear more about that in a minute. But I think we really have to constantly challenge ourselves, and I know those of you in the audience that want to make an impact. And some fantastic scholars like Engels once stated, rights need to be presented in local cultural terms in order to be persuasive, but they must challenge existing reflections of power in order to be effective. And how do we bring this balance between persuasive and effective closer together? And I do think that the ICRC over the years has done really interesting work in the area of cultural connection. We've got work done by Spared by the Spear in Somalia that looked at traditional folklores around that. We've got Arabic epics, which was about stories and poems from the Middle East, and similar work in Guatemala. Because we all know, as humans, we learn through stories. The importance of myths and narratives help us make sense of the world. And as psychologist Jonathan Haidt once said, human thinking depends on metaphor. We understand new or complex things in relation to the things we already know. So I think we have to be really reflective on that, but also be careful of the dangers. And as the Vice President expressed, the last Roots of Behaviour in War really stressed the dangers in going down the cultural path and urged us to focus more on the structural path. And I think we cannot ignore those dangers. But what's very exciting, that I'm about to pass over to the actual researchers, is that this new research gives us other avenues to explore while still making sure we hold on to the legitimacy of the normative framework of IHL, but other ways we can make it useful. And I think at the end of the day, we need to find creative, intelligent and respectful ways to ensure that the statement, even wars have limits, is felt to belong to everybody. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to those who would like to unpack what the study's about.
I want to start by reiterating some of what they have been speaking about. And when we came across this photo in a photo bank, it really spoke very much to the whole essence, really, of what we're talking about with the Roots of Restraint in War study. As you can see, all these people, which are actually youth going off to a military camp in Hong Kong, and you can see how they are mobilized. They're going off to have a deep socialization into the norms of the group. And by socialization we mean the way that people adopt the norms and the laws of a group. And so off they are going to, in their uniforms, to be brought along into the culture of this group and to defend and die if necessary for this group. And this is where the ICRC in the past has felt very comfortable in dealing with these kinds of formal groups that have quite strong rules that are written down and formal, and then they have training regimes through which the socialization occurs, and then there are the compliance mechanisms to make sure that people obey the rules. And these were the recommendations, the strong recommendations from the Roots of Behaviour in War study from 2004, which we set out to update. Prior to that, as Helen and Jill have both spoken about, the ICRC did a lot of dissemination, which was really about explaining the law. And whilst there were some, pretty innovative activities going on to try to find some basis of common grounds between international humanitarian law and the cultural laws and traditions of different groups, the Roots of Behaviour in War said we must focus much more on the law because it's less relativist than these cultural values, and therefore that's really where the emphasis was put in the ICRC over the past 15 or so years. So that's where we feel most comfortable, and that's why this photo speaks very much about socialization. The second thing this photo speaks to us is about the fact that with their arm and fist raised, they can be socialized towards violence and they can be socialized towards restraint. Now, we were very much influenced in our direction that we took towards looking at restraint by the work of Elizabeth Wood and of Scott Strauss. In the ICRC, normally we are documenting cases of violations of international humanitarian law and forced displacement, unlawful killing, and a lot of work has been done on the question of why do people violate laws? Why do they commit atrocities? But we found the work of Elizabeth Wood and Scott Strauss very interesting in that Scott Strauss looked at the genocide in Rwanda, and then he started to unpack, well, why did violence descend into genocide in Rwanda, but violence did not in the Côte d'Ivoire descend into genocide? What were the differences? What were the mechanisms of de-escalation and of restraint? And so that got us thinking, well, that's a very interesting question to be posing. Elizabeth Wood has been looking at rape in armed conflict, and she's been posing the question, why did the Tamil Tigers, who treated civilians very brutally but very rarely engaged in rape, what was it about the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE in Sri Lanka, that prohibited or curbed the use of rape by them? So that really got us thinking about the interest of this question of restraint, because it opens up our scope of vision a lot more than just focusing on why do violations occur. Because when you start thinking about restraint, you start thinking about who or what might be responsible for that restraint. And as soon as we sort of took this avenue of inquiry, different examples of restraint seem to jump out of us. For instance, in South Sudan, 2 examples came to us quite quickly. One was of the White Army that was marching down and passed through 2 Dinka villages before razing to the ground the 3rd village. Now, what was it in those first 2 villages? What deals had been done? What arrangements had been made? What was it that prevented anything from happening in these first 2 villages and then led to this violence in the 3rd? Another example that came from South Sudan was an attack on the village of Kodok. The ICRC was informed by the different parties who were about to have a big clash in the town that the ICRC should evacuate the hospital. Now, you're all aware that since 2013 in particular, the attacks on healthcare infrastructure in South Sudan has been absolutely terrible, with hospitals looted across the board. So when the ICRC evacuated the patients and put the padlocks on the hospital doors, it never imagined to come back and find that the hospital would be untouched. And yet, when they came back, okay, the outer compound had been looted, but the padlocks were still on the doors and it had not been touched. So this led the sub-delegation to start thinking about, well, what or who has ordered that this hospital be spared? And that also shows that perhaps the uncontrolled violence that we're always hearing about is not quite as uncontrolled as before. So we felt that it really is very interesting to look at restraint for the policy hooks and the investigative questions that it poses towards us. And the third thing about this photo, which is really telling, is that from a distance, it looks very uniform. Everybody looks the same. But the closer you look in the photo, the more you realise that the faces of all these different individuals, the gender mix, and the faces of them are very, very different. And we have found that even when studying very organised state armed forces, there is an incredible amount of variation in their sources of influence on their restraint or their use of violence. And so these were 3 themes that have come out from us throughout the study. So that's to give you the overview. How did we go about the study? Well, we set 2 objectives when we set out to update the 2004 Roots of Behaviour in War study. The first was to say, okay, well, let's think about the findings from the last study, which were advising the ICRC to go from just disseminating knowledge of the law into trying to integrate the law into the formal doctrine, into the compliance mechanisms, and into the training of these armed groups, both state armed groups and non-state armed groups. And so we thought, let's unpack that a little bit more and let's have a look at what works and try and find some evidence for what works. So that was one of the major objectives of the update. And the second was that even at the time of the launch in 2004 of the previous study, somebody raised the question, well, this is fine if an armed group has a training mechanism and formal rules and formal compliance mechanisms, but what about the armed groups that seem to be emerging and proliferating around the world that don't have this sort of structure? How do we influence their behaviour? So that question has been around for the last 15 years, and we are hopefully going to move a little bit more towards that answer tonight. So what we decided to do, as Gilles mentioned, was we did a call for proposals. We said, look, we really need some help with this. There are experts in armed group behaviour. So we put out a call for proposals to tap into their interest and their expertise, and we were overwhelmed by the response. We had more than 50 really good proposals to look at armed group behaviour. And we had to juggle which researchers we would take, which armed groups they were proposing to study, with what the delegations in the field would be acceptable, what they wanted to know, and that was a fairly complicated process. But as Jill mentioned, in the end we came out with 4 different types of armed groups, and Brian will explain how we got to that. But so our researcher to look at state armed groups was Andrew Bell, and he did a comparative study of the Australian Armed Forces and the Philippine Armed Forces. And then we had Francisco Gutierrez-Sanin, who has been studying the FARC and the ELN for many, many years in Colombia, and he he teamed up with Elizabeth Wood to put a proposal together. And then for our non-state armed groups, with decentralized non-state armed groups, we had Ivan Guichua and Fedez Boulel, who looked at Ansardine in Mali and Mujau, two Islamist movements in Mali. And our fourth study was, we had a very bright anthropologist, Naomi Pendle, who was coming out and finishing her PhD after 5 years working with the cattle guarding groups in South Sudan. And so she conducted a study for us there. So I will pass over to Brian to explain to you how we went about looking at these questions.
Thank you. There we go. Perfect. So as has been mentioned before, we talk about the proliferation of non-state armed groups, and a statistic that we like to use is that more armed groups have emerged in the last 6 years than the previous 6 decades. And just if you start to think about that, the sheer sort of scale of what's involved makes both the operations more difficult. But one other sort of added piece that has been alluded to by my colleagues is that the nature of those groups has also changed. Historically, groups have been very vertically organized in sort of communist, sort of Maoist model. And so in many ways, we were very comfortable because all the tools that we learned with state forces work there. They've got training regimes, they've got various different ways of infusing IHL into codes of conduct. But if an organization doesn't have those things, what do you hold on to? And so, as has been alluded to, that's sort of one of the key pieces of what was driving this study, is to try to understand what do we do with these horizontal groups who don't have all these structures and don't have all these different training mechanisms that we can use as we have before. And so, one of the things that we did to be able to look at that was to look at how organizations were structured. Okay, I'll just go and there we go, perfect. And so we began to start looking at the way in which groups were structured. And one of the key findings, as it turns out, and it perhaps isn't surprising, is that the nature of how a group is structured actually reflects the sources of restraint that are acting upon its members. And where we began to start looking at that was actually how we structured the study. So if you can look from the most sort of vertically organized, sort of state militaries, all the way down to becoming more decentralized until we get to community embedded groups who really remain part of their community. And in many ways, those groups often don't even decide when and how they fight. And so we began to start looking at basically 2 case studies in each one of these each one of these types, which allowed us to not only compare between types, but also within types. And so, as we'll talk a little bit more when we get into some of the specific examples, this allowed us to really begin to start looking at how the different structures affected not only behavior, but also on restraint. And this leads us to one of the key findings, is that as groups become more decentralized, the role of external actors becomes much more significant, to the extent that when you get to the sort of final level here, as far as community embedded groups, they often don't even decide when and how they fight. So for an organization like us, if you want to be dealing with the fighters in this particular case, that's important. But if they're not deciding actually how they fight and when, you have to start beginning to realize that there are all these other actors around them that are often making those decisions. What makes that even more complicated is that those people, individuals, and sometimes organizations, are often competing for that control. So it doesn't remain the same even in the same community. And so this poses significant challenges for an organization like the ICRC because we can't all become anthropologists and spend 5 years like Naomi Pendle in a particular community. At the same time, in order to be able to operate intelligently and efficiently in these kinds of environments, we need to know enough to be able to understand who's actually calling the shots in many of these circumstances. And so for us, it's always important, though, that we sort of add as a caveat that this is obviously a fairly simple model, so groups can shift back and forth across these different types of armed groups, and that not every group will fit cleanly into this particular spectrum. But for us, what was interesting is that organization actually matters. Now, obviously, this doesn't replace sort of a nuanced understanding of an entire community in the group, but as a starting point, it really provides clues as to where you start looking for the types of restraint that are actually affecting each one of these different types of groups, which we're going to talk a little bit more now.
So one of the most interesting things for me in this project, and I was very fortunate to be able to accompany Andrew Bell when we went to Australia to interview the Australian Armed Forces, the Army. We conducted about more than 400 interviews with different ranks within the Australian military, and Andrew had previously surveyed over 1,000 active members of the Philippine Armed Forces, which was really incredible to be able to get that sort of access, and that's very much thanks to the ICRC Philippine delegation's contacts with the armed force. So when we went to Australia, Andrew had some very, very interesting ways to try to tease out influence. I mean, how do you measure influence? How do you answer these questions about who has influence on whom? And if you go, and of course our ethical review, we were not able to pretend that we weren't the ICRC and we were somebody else going ahead. We had to come fully in with saying we are from the ICRC and we want to have your views on how well you respect international humanitarian law. Well, you can imagine that most people want to say that they do, of course, respect international humanitarian law. So Andrew put together some very interesting surveys, which were quite long, but they were experimental surveys, and they pitched different dilemmas. So he tried to tease out the different aspects, like, for instance, pitching forced protection versus civilian protection. What would you do in this hypothetical scenario? And so that people couldn't just give a right or wrong answer. They had to actually, they had to weigh these things against each other. So that was, it was very interesting. And this is one of the more interesting findings that came out. I mean, there were many interesting findings. For instance, in the Philippines, who they consider to be the most influential person or force on their behaviour is very different from the Australians. Who is the most influential teacher was very different from the Australians. For the Australians, you have credibility if you have mud on your boots. If you have faced these dilemmas in the field, you have credibility. The legal lawyers, the army lawyers, didn't have as much credibility for the Australians. In the Philippines, sorry, Helen.
I just touched your shoulder.
But in the Philippines, it was actually the opposite. The international lawyer seemed to have much more credibility with the Filipino armed forces than a Philippine soldier coming back with mud on his boots. So this pointed, as I mentioned before, to the variation and the fact that we need to dig quite deeply into the preferences and the structures of these armed forces to understand a bit more. So in this particular survey question, we were trying to unpack the relative importance of formal and informal norms. We had come to this because when we talk about socialisation, it seemed to be the one aspect that was really going across all of the different armed groups, regardless of whether they are vertically structured or embedded in their groups. The question of how do the fighters get socialised within their group and what ways might the ICRC tap into that socialisation became a very interesting question. And we've only ever in the ICRC really focused on the formal socialisation, but we know from the work of Elizabeth Wood and others and the reports in the media that even in the most professional state armed forces, they have never been able to stamp out the practices of hazing. That hazing is the sort of the ways that sometimes these very harsh mechanisms in groups, it's not just in militaries but also in universities, etc. To join the group you have to submit to certain practices, etc. And the persistence of sexual violence, which has been a real problem in many state militaries, including the American state military and also the Australians. And so we wanted here to tease out the relative importance of informal norms and formal norms under IHL. So what this survey shows is that in the control group, which is over to my right, people were proposed a hypothetical scenario about you've been asked to give your opinion to your commanding officer on whether an operation should go ahead, which is to target a high-value bomb maker in a suburban built-up area. Would you say yes, or would you agree to do it, or would you not agree to do it? And you can see that most people, so the bottom line is officers, the top line is other ranks. Most people were pretty convinced that for a high-value bomb maker that it should go ahead. Then the next treatment survey gives one more piece of information, which says that the army legal officer says that this would violate IHL. And so there you can see that there's a dip. Interestingly enough, it's only a dip to ambivalence, which is somewhat shocking, but nevertheless it is a dip. Then the next treatment was that 50% of your peer group considers the operation to be unethical. Okay, so this was the peer group pressure part. And you can see it for other ranks, it's pretty much even with the legal officer, and for officers it's slightly less influential. But then when you see the combined, so the last treatment survey said that, gave both pieces of information, that 50% of your peer group says that is unethical, and the legal officer suggests that it's would be a violation of IHL. And there you can see that suddenly most of the officers completely disagree with this operation going ahead. So that's quite a significant finding for us about the importance of starting to tackle the informal norms and not just the formal norms within state armed forces. Because as a combined effort, we think this can go a lot further. Well, how do you do that, you might ask? And this answer came also a little bit by accident from, like all good research, from the Australian case, in that when we were in focus groups and we were talking about these findings, we started to realize that we heard from the soldiers that in order to tackle some of the informal norms around sexual violence within the military, the Australian Army had introduced a new value for the Australian Army, which was the value of respect. And it was very interesting because it was almost a hybrid between the formal laws of IHL and the informal norms, because you were not punished for not showing enough respect as long as it didn't violate any law, but you were not promoted, you were not held in high esteem by the military if you did not embody this notion of respect. And so we thought this was a very interesting way of having a hybrid between the formal and the informal sides, which will then, open to further investigation by the ICRC about what this means for us and the implications. And we found too, coming out of the focus groups, but also out of the research, that the norms of restraint really need to be socialised much more into the military. It's got to go beyond just the socialisation in you can't do this, it's against the law. So it's really here that we differ with the findings of the Roots of Restraint in war study, and we take us a little bit further back into our history and say, well, actually, we think that respect for the law gains a lot more traction if you're able to make it about the identity of the soldier. It's not what I do. I don't do it because it's against the law. I don't do it. I don't violate IHL because it's not who I am. And so we are very much looking at ways in the future to help instill these notions within the state armed forces.
Another example we want to talk a little bit about is Mali. And this chapter really started getting into decentralized groups. And by what I mean by that is groups that often appear from the outside to be one group, but actually are made up of a bunch of smaller groups. And we often hear the term sort of fragmentation. And in many ways, what the research has shown is that to look at those groups as one group is actually a mistake. In many ways, they're an alliance. And so that fragmentation isn't actually breaking apart of the group. It's just a realignment of those smaller groups and the alliances that they have with all the other groups that they're operating within. And why this is important is basically because there often is this sort of narrative of chaos in these kinds of contexts. And one of the things that comes out very clearly from the research is that this is very rarely the case. Sort of unrestrained violence, the chaotic violence, is actually very rarely the case, especially in a sustained manner. But in many times, this can actually be a bit of a strategy for those behind some of the violence, because in many ways they can't be held accountable if the violence is seen as chaotic, and in some ways the media narrative often sort of embraces that and perpetuates it. And so it became very important for us to sort of explore a little bit more into decentralized groups. And so we did that in Mali, and these were two Islamist groups, as was mentioned before, Mujahou and Ansar Dine. Now, what became very interesting for us is that they were both part of the Al-Qaeda movement, or Al-Qaeda larger network. And each one of them was able to take over their respective areas in Mali, not really through fighting, but actually through negotiation. And it's a very long story as to how that unfolded, but it was actually local notables who almost invited them in to help deal with the level of violence that was there. So they both sort of came in similar manners. But the way in which they then sort of tried to display replace those that were there, and the level of violence and the level of types of violence that they used actually were quite different. And so you have two groups that both technically follow Al-Qaeda philosophy, that have the same sort of legacy, but in many ways they use violence in completely different ways. One used suicide bombers, the other one very rarely ever did. One attacked other Malian armed groups, one group didn't. One used forced marriage on a regular basis, the other one didn't. How can you explain sort of two groups that theoretically should operate in similar ways having such completely different patterns of violence? And so one of the things that began to sort of explore with this case study is the role of communities and how linked particular groups were to communities. And so with one of the groups, it turns out that actually, because of their sort of history in that community, a lot of the rules that they implemented within the communities weren't actually decided by them. They actually outsourced to local shura councils and various different judges and the sort of history of a couple hundred years of how Islam was understood in that community to actually make decisions about how they should be governing and operating. And so for us, this became interesting because even with sort of what people might call extreme cases as this, you can see the role of communities and their ability to shape the behavior of different groups. From the outside, that may not be obvious, but it becomes very important to be able to sort of work beyond that. And so this leads us to some extent, is trying to translate or trying to research into practice is always a challenge. We can have sort of very intellectual conversations and very interesting ideas about sort of nuances of some of this, but what does it mean for delegations? What does it mean for heads of subdelegations in what they're doing? And so what we tried to do in basically laying out these sort of 4 blueprints is to basically say, you know, one of the clear ideas that comes out of the study is that variation is important, nuance is important, but at the same time, so we can't find one solution fits all model. But the role of organization became very important, and it was, as it turns out, a really good way of beginning to see what some of the sources of restraint would be for a group. So we basically created sort of engagement blueprints for each of the different types of groups. And it deals with 4 things quite simply. One, just some characteristics of that particular group, key insights from the study related to that type, and then important questions to ask. So to sort of a little bit of guidance as to what are the things that really are important about this type of group and that you need to know, because there are obviously variations. And then finally, approaches that have worked in the past. And so for us, this was a way of ensuring that the research it came down to a sort of practical blueprint for how people could actually use it and apply it. We've actually pilot tested this in 1 or 2 places and found it to be very useful, because what we find with a lot of first and second mission delegates, but even large sub-delegations, is that they deal with, in some cases, 20, 30, 40, 80 different groups. How do you make sense of that? You can't possibly come up with engagement strategies for each one of these groups. But by looking at the different types of groups, you begin to start realizing actually there's certain groups that kind of operate similarly. So we can start actually making some sense of everything that we're dealing with. And so for us, this was a way of beginning to start sort of translating what can be very academic results into things that are practical for ICRC.
Well, thank you very much. I think that capacity to really hone in tonight to hear that organisation matters, that there are preferences about structures and personnel in training, that the combination of formal and informal through evidence is much more powerful, that communities have a role to play, and that there is a practical blueprint that we can sort of put situations through is really, really important. So thank you for that. We've got some time tonight, in fact, some good amount of time for some questions and answers from the audience, maybe some questions here and some answers there, and maybe the other way around. But I just wondered whether each of you, before we did that, whether I could indulge and ask each of you, what was your favourite bit of the study? Because, as I said, these colleagues of mine, plus others that are here tonight, and Luigi and the Prevention Cell and many involved, have really had to lean into this intellectually. You're grasping at things and trying to put the most intelligent structure around it. So if I had to ask you, Brian, what you liked best or the most exciting bit?
I think there were sort of 2, or it's really one that has sort of 2 aspects. One is the way in which so much of the experience of ICRC and what we are finding just sort of fit together. And so when we were talking to people, and to some extent were the blueprints, this isn't sort of the study coming and telling ICRC. It was actually the way in which, as a collective group, we went through so many different discussions, and how a lot of this was actually formed through discussions with delegations and with colleagues, and how that actually brought a lot of shape to what we were doing. But as far as the sort of specifics, for me it was this category of embedded groups. We talked a lot about decentralized groups, but we sort of started talking in our work with Naomi Pendle around these cattle guarders who fight one day but then melt back down into their communities. And from an IHL perspective, this was challenging and really began to sort of, are they an armed group, are they not? And for me, what was fascinating is, as an armed group specialist, is to really realize that these groups, in many cases, didn't decide when and how they fought. And so this idea that actually, the sort of expert in non-state armed groups who's looking at all the guys with guns, not fully appreciating how much, for some of these groups, they literally are part of the community, and how we understand who influences them is something more than just looking at the people with the guns.
Thank you. Fiona, what kept you awake at night?
Well, for me, being a researcher myself, it's rather frustrating actually to work with a whole lot of researchers who are out there doing the really fun stuff in the field, and you end up doing all the writing back home. So I thought I did get a raw end of the stick. So it was really great when I was actually able to go to Australia and carry out these surveys with Andrew. And it was actually after delivering or doing one of the surveys in Duntroon, which is the officer training course in Canberra, very prestigious, and we had given out our surveys, and then we were collecting that, and a couple of the young cadets came up to us and they were really upset, and they sort of said, oh gosh, you've got to talk to our commanding officers because this has just raised some issues for us about what we were engaged in, and you must talk to them. So we did talk to them in our focus group, and we found that there had been a change in the ethical approach in Australia in the military recently. A new person was in charge of the training in the ethics of the battlefield ethics training course, and they had a capstone exercise at the end of this training where the cadets are basically food deprived and sleep deprived for 3 days, and they're expected under big pressure to really showing what battlefield conditions might be like. And then the Australians had set up in a certain place on about the third day, they had sort of feigned, some of the Special Forces people had got together, and they were pretending to be sort of waterboarding some prisoners behind a screen. And apparently, and then, so these guys came up over the top and they were very exhausted, and then the Special Forces guy would just say to them, hey, fill up that bucket for me. And they were filming them, all the soldiers, and this was quite a few classes that went through, and almost systematically the soldiers went and filled up the buckets. And this was filmed, and it was shown back to them anonymously afterwards, and this is what they were talking about. They were so shocked to realise how easily they had just gone along with it when they were sleep deprived, when they were food deprived. They had just done as they were told. They had, lost that aspect of trying to think about the fact that they realised what was going on. They had in the back of their minds realised what was going on, but they hadn't been able to translate that into actions to say, no, I'm not going to participate in this. And they were very shocked. And it was a fantastic exercise because the Australian military had taken that on board totally and were really reorganising their ethics course, and were absolutely adamant that that this training has to be tested under duress in order to know that it's, what its effect will be in the field. If we don't test it under duress, it can easily fall apart. And so that was one of the other findings that came out from the study, and it was really great for us to have sort of discovered it in that way rather than having read it in a textbook.
And then I just wanted to share what I was very excited about years ago when it was quite unpopular at the time in looking at ways to connect stories about the Pacific and IHL, there was a palm leaf, a particular palm leaf that I remember one of my students showed me and said that if you hold up this palm leaf and you don't carry a weapon, you can walk through the battlefield and no one will attack you. And at that time I was struggling trying to explain to the government the importance of legislation to protect the Red Cross emblem. And suddenly I realised I could just say, we've been dealing with this issue for a short time. You've got an ancient history of the licus palm, and hold that up. And suddenly you had a capacity to just talk about what is really, really important about protection. The other thing I wanted to flag was speaking once to a very old gentleman who was at the time a Minister of Defence in a Pacific country, explaining the Red Cross emblem, and he turned to me and said, "So the Red Cross emblem is black magic?" And I said, not really. As an international lawyer, the Red Cross emblem is all in here, baby. And he said, no, black magic is if you believe in it and you practice it, it protects you. And it suddenly hit me that whilst I wouldn't be, and certainly as Director of Law and Policy, advocating an article on the black magic of the Red Cross, that it was fascinating to see the capacity of absorption about this idea of application. So I think we've got some interesting times ahead.
I'm Matthias van Hullebust. I'm a visiting fellow at the Geneva Academy, but I'm actually based at Shanghai Jiao Tong University. I find it very interesting how you analyze the socialization of norms and there's various parameters, including organization and informal and formal norms. But to pick up again on one of the observations in the previous study, which refer to violations of IHL, which are ascribed to moral disengagement of the fighters. So meaning the moral causes or religious causes inform how they apply or not apply the laws of war. And the second element also refer to the dehumanization of the enemy. So these are like different conclusions which look at outer dynamics of the restraint, whereas this study looks at inner dynamics, the socialization of norms. I've not read the study, so perhaps you didn't have time to deal with this question either, but is this part of this project as well or not?
So Tammy Evans from the Geneva Centre for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces. I'd just like to ask a question whether you did any gender disaggregation in your study. If you did, what were the findings? If you did not, why not? Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Diego. I work for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it's more of a methodological question. I was wondering if you use any kind of set theory. It's very interesting how you group your counterfactuals, and I was wondering if you use set theory, qualitative comparative analysis. I've been doing some work with that, and I think it could be applicable to the study, and I don't know if it's there.
What was interesting about, for us at least, for the study, was that we had both sort of very quant people, as you can tell by the graph that was up there and some of the work that Andrew Bell did, but then you had on the other side of the spectrum Naomi Pendle, who was an anthropologist who spent 5 years doing field work. And so we actually combined sort of both qualitative and quantitative measures. And each sort of researcher or research teams in some cases brought different elements and different theories. And so we've really profited by the way in which different groups, and so some people were able to draw on that comparative model and be able to do that. Mali was a good example of that, while others focused much more on sort of the anthropology and the sort of qualitative elements. But this was for us one of the strengths, is that instead of just taking one approach, it allowed us to really test to some extent some of the underlying findings, and I think we had a sort of operating theory around the role of structure, for example, as just one of multiple ones. But it really allowed us to test it from a couple angles, because until we sort of saw the alignment with both qual and quant coming together, we really didn't find that those findings were as strong. And so it was the combination that allowed us, I think, to bring at least the different experiences to bear in the findings.
To your question on gender desegregation, in fact, we are doing that right now. And in fact, we are using it as an example within the ICRC of what does gender mean, how would gender disaggregation of a study like this occur. So Helen Kinsella, who is a fabulous academic, and she's got a grant, or she's on sabbatical with the Council of Foreign Relations at the moment, and she's giving up her time to the ICRC, and this is one of the projects that she's going to be working on, is to take apart our study now and analyse it through a gender lens. And even though we are frightened of what the outcome might be, I think it's going to be a very, very good way for everybody to look at a study that they can probably read and relate to, and then see what we've missed because we haven't applied a gender lens to it until this point. So I think it's going to be a very, very exciting educational process for us all. And to your question about the moral disengagement and dehumanization of the enemy, was this part of the study? This is obviously still a very big issue that we see all around the world, these two aspects that were very much highlighted in the previous study. The previous study looked very much at the psychosocial aspects of what makes a fighter firstly kill, and put aside all that they have been taught about the illegality of killing, of murder, and then being able to kill. And then how do atrocities occur and how fighters disengage morally from their acts and justify what they've done according to what's been going on. And the dehumanization, which of course is as true today as ever. In fact, we see it all over, that there is this terrible dehumanization going on. We decided that, in fact, the literature was still very rich and it was very relevant still. All of this is very relevant for looking at behaviour in war. So we decided not to tackle it from that aspect because we didn't have a huge amount of new things to say. I mean, the Roots of Behaviour in War study was also based on, 1974, Stanley Milgren's experiments, etc. And all of this is very pertinent. So we decided instead to look at the peer group as being our unit of analysis as opposed to the individual, because also the peer group is the one similarity across all of our different types of groups. It is this small group of, Brian will say, less than 150 people, which even the Romans were talking about. It's that group, and how does the interaction occur in that group? But we did deal with this question a little bit in our findings about the moral disengagement, because certainly in our surveys with the Philippines Armed Forces, some of the young soldiers who have come out of Marawi and other places says, why should we respect the laws of war when the enemy does not? What is it in there for us? We are just, lambs to the slaughter by following the law. And so this is where, again, the socialization came in, and this idea through Jeffrey Sheckel's work of the different levels or different types of socialization. And we thought this was very interesting, a bit geeky perhaps, but very interesting for the ICRC to think about these different levels. Type 0 socialization is when somebody does something only because of reward or punishment. Okay, so they haven't actually internalized any of the values themselves. It's just about reward and punishment. So that's type 0 socialization. Type 1 socialization is when you do something because it is expected of you by your peer group. And I think in the ICRC, in our work, we deal a lot with that type of socialization. Following the law, this is right, this is wrong. And the peer group expects it of you. But type 2 socialization is the internalization of these values to being about who you are, your identity, the warrior, all these unwritten rules like, that the military have that are not written down, never leave a soldier behind on the battlefield. These are very, very strong, and this for us looks like the strongest way, and it's almost like the only argument you can give back to somebody who says, why should I respect the laws of war when my enemy doesn't? Well, it's because of who you are. And so we felt that it's not new. This has been around a long time, the warrior's honor, but we really felt that it was a stronger argument on which to base things than just to simply say, well, you have to because these are the rules of war.
Just to add to that, in some ways what was interesting that came out of the research is that those dynamics you're talking about happen at the individual but also at the group level. So that when groups go through certain experiences, that can begin to start changing how they see the world as a group. And there were two pieces of the research that for me, which was the other thing I almost was going to answer, is that there's this tipping point around 50%, that when groups begin to start thinking similarly, or when 50% of a group has a certain idea, it actually isn't dramatically different than 75%. So that if you begin to start as a group having a certain set of values and norms, that actually there becomes this tipping point, so that it can happen at multiple levels. And the other thing that came out of that was that therefore reinforcement. So IHL is important for setting the tone and this idea of socialization, and this is where the military specialists in the room will sort of chip in on this, but that the idea that reinforcing at certain moments also becomes important. That it's not just, the example was used is that when something happens, usually when there's a loss in a unit, having someone come down to actually reinforce in those moments is actually beginning to get at that, not at the individual level just, but actually at a group level as well, because they interact with each other in very interesting ways. And so that was the other piece that I think started to figure out how those two fit together. But it's its own set of social science discussions as to the individual and group narratives and how they intertwine.
Thank you. And I think, to me, the most important thing about this study is the word "and." It's a study that says it's the normative framework, we have to work on strengthening that, we have to confirm that, and it's this other element. And I think in life it usually is the "and" rather than the "or", but I think the "and" here is really important.
Achim Benmer from the Graduate Institute and the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform. Congratulations for your study. We've been all awaiting it for a long time. And I just would like to emphasize the significance of your study. That has implications way beyond the humanitarian space. Because I think also actors from the peacebuilding and peace negotiations fields will have a very deep look at the study. Particularly, I wanted to ask you about what your feeling is, how the change in the structure of armed groups, specifically the last two elements of the armed groups, may have really very practical implications how to think about humanitarian dialogue. If there is really no, if the individuals or groups one is in touch with in order to identify hostilities or other types of reductions of violence, but they are not really in charge of deciding on the way violence is fought, then what does this tell you about the way one has to rethink humanitarian dialogue and also the practice of peace negotiations that seem to be modeled on the first type of actor, which have much more hierarchical types of decision-making structures? So just a small questions to you, and
minor detail.
An answer we can ponder about over the next year.
Dylan Widder from the UK mission, and thank you for a fantastic study. We were really pleased and delighted, as well as I come from DFID back in the UK. A couple of questions, really, I suppose a bit more for ICRC actually. How do you see this study changing your operations? Because obviously it does have clear implications for the way in which you work, and also the national societies are the entry point in a lot of these examples. So it'd just be interesting to hear a little bit about that. And then the other question for me is, will this help with access? Does this help you understand the sort of broader networks like ISIL that are transboundary, but also the sort of lessons I guess you can learn from, and we've already had presentations in the past about the links between armed organised crime in South America and ISIL in, say, the Middle East. Can this help bring a better sense of understanding across those kind of different groups? Thanks.
Hi, good evening. My name is Lai. I'm a legal researcher with MSF, and I'll add a caveat. This question is a bit self-serving, but you spoke at the beginning about how there have been increasing attacks on medical personnel and healthcare providers in armed conflict. I was wondering whether during your study you found anything relating to the restraint that didn't pan out with regard to medical personnel, and what have these changed norms of armed conflict or differing characteristics of groups done with regard to the IHL norm of respect for medical providers?
Well, that's a very, very good question, and I think certainly the Healthcare in Danger project here is very interested in looking historically, because we need to answer this question as to whether attacks on healthcare are worse today globally around the world than in the past. It certainly seems to be, but we need to put a bit of perhaps evidence to that. We were particularly looking at South Sudan, where I think we can pretty solidly say that since 2013 there has been a terrible erosion in respect and in the norms of restraint, which we have seen in the past people respecting a lot more. And so our study does go into, in the case study of South Sudan, what were those traditional norms and what is it that has help them to erode, and why has this happened? And of course then the question is, how can we reinstate some of these norms? And this is a very interesting question, I think, because it raises all sorts of dilemmas and questions. Apparently in the Nuer tribe there is the sort of the Nuer spirit is the bad blood, and if you commit atrocities then you know you are pretty much damned. But you could perhaps in the past have had prophets reinstating the Nuer, the good blood. But it seems that for many of these fighters, it's gone too far almost, and they sort of have abandoned the idea that they are redeemable, and therefore the violence has spiraled. So that was one of the things that we discussed in our report. But another interesting thing, I think, for us to take forward and answers a little bit Hashem's question about the implications of this study, I think we're going to wrestle with some very interesting dilemmas. And because once you start talking about trying to find traction with local beliefs and local customs, you also then do enter this very murky area of, well, can you really cherry pick which local customs that you like and which you don't like? Is it all right to say that, oh, okay, well, you know, we like this part because this custom because it accords with IHL, but we don't like this one. And this came up very clearly in our South Sudan study where in one of the interviews, one of the cattle guarders said, yes, it's much worse now. Now we kill the women. In the past, we used to marry them. And it was sort of, okay.
Kidnap and marry
Yes, so you sort of think, okay, but are we going to be there sort of saying, well, good, let's go back to the old ways. So this is, I think, a very interesting area for us to start thinking about, is what are the ethical implications, where do we explore this further? And I think that was one of the reasons perhaps why the Roots of Behaviour in War study had said, look, let's make it objectively about the law and not go into this murky area of customs and traditions. But I think that definitely the work of the ICRC, particularly in trying to find traction between Islamic law and international humanitarian law, has really been so rich and so all-encompassing that I think that this has set the stage for really interesting discussions and debates over finding commonalities and traction, which will make this respect for IHL a lot deeper.
I was going to look to you guys for the changing
The
practice.
second one, Dylan, yes, look, thank you. I think what's really important is that what we don't want this to be is to be a revolution. It has to be something that impacts upon the way we work, our operational work, but particularly in the area of prevention work and protection. But it has to be evolving. And I think one of the ideas of having at the back, you'll see of the report, I think Brian walked us through some I would say structures or framework for our colleagues in the delegation to try and get a better understanding of the situation they're facing and to run through their experiences through, well, is it an integrated state force? Is it centralized? Is it non-centralized? What has worked? What is not? What are the insights? So we definitely want it to have an impact. We don't, I don't make my colleagues suffer like this for years and, without having an impact. But I think if you're genuine about trying to make change, you do it in a way that is respectful and you evolve it into your practices. I look certainly very much to our armed forces delegates and others to really sit with these findings, to think about them. To be honest, a lot of it is an evidence of intuitive understandings. Any good delegate in the field does not go racing up and take the book that I love and thrust it towards a young soldier who's had too much to drink at a checkpoint. Most good delegates work out the way of finding a connection with that. I only talk about with my kids about IHL when I talk about Game of Thrones and, try and find elements of that, of IHL within that. You've got to find what makes sense. So to answer your question, yes, I think we need to carefully and intelligently use these frameworks. We need to use the and. We need to make sure, for example, it is really fantastic to be able to, and I'll say it because you're a donor, but to look at anyone in the eye and say, we have evidence that training matters, but what we need to do, the and, is it has an impact on who trains and how they train. And that's once again something we've always done. We don't have the same PowerPoints for across the world. So at the moment, we wanted to finish it, launch it, sit with it, think about it, but certainly the real aim and the impact it will have is how it helps us understand the environment better and be even better at influencing behaviour.
In some ways, it's an interesting insight because, as you said, mediation and international mediation have always been based on the model of trying to keep as few people in the room as possible. That's the sort of general principle. But if you have these groups who appear to be one group from the outside, but actually it's the sub-commanders who hold most of the influence, you're pretty much doomed at that point. And we see this in a lot of places. So it does call for a fairly radical change of how peacemaking is done. Because now, and I'll use, in the case of Libya, there were 236 armed groups in one city. The idea of asking one person to be responsible for all of them when some of them are actually alliances, so you have like alliances of alliances, this is a fundamental different way of how we approach it, and we see, I would argue, the failure of a bunch of peace processes because of that. And so I think that does change the way. But it even is as practical for our subdelegations who have to get green light to go to an area. It's no longer about talking to the leader. We now have to talk to 5 or 6 or 7 commanders who might be in control of that area, who are often competing with each other. So it adds a level of complexity that has before not been something that we've had to deal with in the same amount at least.
So thank you.
Thank you. Antonella Bernardini from OHCHR. I was wondering if you found any differences depending on the age composition of the groups, in particular non-state armed groups that use or recruit children, or whose fighters are adults but entered the group as children.
Okay. Hello, I'm Konstantin Kleine from a PhD candidate at the Graduate Institute. For the question, I would come back to what you have said in the beginning, that it comes down a lot to who a certain person is, and maybe we can find another end in there. I understand you that most of the behavior you saw, or a lot of the behavior, is actually based on a value judgment, like maybe a basic judgment of fairness. I would never attack an unarmed person because it's just not a fair deal, but maybe there's also an end. Maybe it's just a personal decision. I would never violate a law. You find this probably in some cultures more than in others. In Switzerland, there's plenty of people who feel bad if they forgot to buy a ticket before they take the tram. But maybe this is also a point where you can build on, at least in some communities. Is there something in the study on the role of law in a society in general that you found which makes a difference on the individual judgments, or is it in the places you looked at mostly places where this value of I would never violate a law is not very common?
Anne Davies, currently independent humanitarian advisor. Thank you. It was extremely interesting, your presentation, and I really hope that this can become operationalized soonest, because I think there's people out in the field crying out for this kind of interaction. And I'm kind of drawing on my own experience last year in the DR Congo, where I was drawing up a protection strategy for the humanitarian country team. And over again, the question came, how do we get access? Because access is being denied more and more. And we need to be able to engage with non-state armed groups. We can, it's over to the mission, it's over to MONUSCO to deal with the main armed groups, but the proliferation of armed groups, and I think you've mentioned it in South Sudan, but in many other places as well in the world, in Libya, especially in the Congo, I think what's specifically interesting is how to engage with the people in the communities, this kind of splintering and a self-defense group like the Mai Mai, and other groups. The Mai Mai is practically, they're practically like innocent children in today's world, whereas you've got these really, really very, very dangerous people that we must engage with in order to get the aid through. So can you give us some kind of an idea? Can this be operationalized? Can it be shared with, but engaging with other humanitarian actors so that there's some kind of training, because they need to be able to reach out to the communities to be able to deliver the aid in a safe way. They're necessarily going to have to engage with these non-state armed groups. How do we do that?
Well, I think for me, one of the things that the ICRC has done quite well in the past, and I would hope it continues and we can expand upon this, is by using the humanitarian assistance that we offer. And the ICRC has a definite advantage here over many organisations in terms of the palette of activities. They're so broad. So with the Taliban in the past, for instance, or in South Sudan, first aid training is something that draws fighters in. They actually want to learn first aid because they'd like to save their colleagues on the battlefield, and this provides a fabulous vector, a fabulous platform through which to start discussing some of these areas of commonality between, their customs or their activities and that of IHL. And the example we point to in the report is from South Sudan, where there's a very proud tradition in many of the different groups in South Sudan of wrestling. And so at a first aid training, a delegate would talk to the guys about their wrestling and, sit down with them and understand the rules of the game. And then once he'd heard the explanation, would then play a bit dumb and sort of say, well, hang on a sec, I don't really understand. so you like to wrestle, but could you challenge that woman over there to this wrestling match? And of course the guy thinks, oh my God, how stupid, she's far too weak, and I couldn't, she would never be a match for me. And what about that child over there? No, the same thing, derisive laughter bursts forth. And then on that basis, being able to open up and to start discussing, well, it's the same thing in warfare. You also, don't challenge people who are not the same capacity of you. They are not worthy of your, to meet you. And so I think that we need to be much more imaginative and have more activities like this, and find ones where, we don't want to. Obviously, with also the cattle guarding groups, the ICRC has very big veterinary vaccination programs, and the cattle are the wealth of the communities. So in trying to, to understand more, use the humanitarian activities also as a vector to start talking about more of these activities, which the ICRC does to a large extent. Perhaps we can become even more imaginative in this field.
To deal with the age issue, it was not something that we sort of were able to bring across all the groups, simply because the data wasn't there for a lot of what we were able to actually pull out of the groups, just because of how sensitive it was. But one of the things that was interesting is between the cattle guarding groups, who basically, most of them are people, or youth in this case, who basically from the age of 5 or 6 are traveling with the actual cattle herds when they go and migrating. So they actually get socialized from literally 5 or 6 years old to become part of those groups. And so in that case, it was much more interesting how the role of the community and the values of the community became infused into those groups and became so important to how they saw the world. So that was for us the only one that was the real distinction, because in some ways the values were not largely distinct from the community values. The other ones were groups who either voluntarily or otherwise would indoctrinate people and go through that ritual. And we're usually a little bit older as a consequence, at least from the case studies that we looked at. So it was not something that we were able to do, but it kind of came out across pieces. The access one is something that we hope to, with the study, at least begin to start answering that question. This idea of training is something that we've thought about, but it's something that, as far as follow-up internally, yes, without question, that will be there. How we do externally is a different issue. But this issue of access for us was really important, and especially as you look at decentralized groups. The case of South Sudan, and I'll use a specific one with one of our sub-delegations, bringing the sub-delegation to talk through this kind of model and to all the experience we had in the room. It was interesting how there were 1 or 2 times where delegates would say, hey, I wish I'd known that 9 months ago. And it wasn't because it was me coming in. It was actually just creating a space between our national staff and our international staff to share across certain issues. And all of a sudden, really interesting insights around how the community embedded groups were actually different in different communities and who was actually able to influence them was kind of assumed, but it was never actually explicitly said. And so it allowed us to all of a sudden change a bunch of programming that we were doing in that area and reach those people more directly because we already had the contacts. We just didn't know that they were the people that we should have been talking to.
And was there any reflections on cultures where you are more law-abiding than others?
This is where Naomi Pendle will be really wonderful. My instinct, though, is that we have to be careful around some of that, because there are a lot of communities where you adhere to very strict laws. They may not be written down in the same way, and so I think that may not cut across cultures as much as we think. And at least the work on the study showed that what groups think does actually change what individuals will do. And this tipping point of different moments. So I think it's, individual is always important. I think you always have to take it into the small group, the larger group, and then the sort of broader contexts that are there to really see how they all play out in different contexts.
And one of the interesting points for me, because I'm not a specialist on armed groups at all, was looking at the difference between how a state armed force acts and socializes its soldiers, and then how a non-state armed group like the FARC does. And because of the difference between being a non-state armed group and a state armed group, you don't get access to all these, the state's facilities, so the monitoring was much weaker, and therefore the socialization had to be much, much tougher. So the project of the FARC was this, really life-encompassing program where people, once they became a recruit in the FARC, they were never allowed to leave. If they were caught trying to desert, they would be executed. And there was a whole life program that marriage occurred within the FARC. And so it was that sort of whole life socialization, which was very, very interesting to see how that compared with that of state armed forces.
Thank you. Well, I will pass for the final word over to our Vice President.
Thank you, Helen. I mean, the very rich and stimulating exchanges brought many reflections to my mind, but I would just like to maybe conclude with two thoughts. One is more anecdotal, and the second is a bit more about what we can do out of it in terms of research, policy, practice, transfer. So the anecdote is a bit like you, Helen. Some 30 years back, I had the chance to go on the first field assignment with the International Committee of the Red Cross. It was in El Salvador. And my first kind of encounter with a non-state armed group, which was the FMLN back then, was with a theater group from San Salvador that we had hired to play the war in villages. So actually we were staging a war in different villages in so-called liberated area, where we knew that among the communities we had members of the non-state armed groups. And actually the actors were asking a number of villagers, among which we had combatants or non-state armed group members, to stage a war in the village, and this was very lively. And then they said, stop, we stop here, and then we discuss what should we do? How should this fighter behave, and what should be done and not be done? And I was wondering, well, beyond the fact that it's highly enjoyable, does it really make a difference? And when I was reading the report and listening to the conversation, I wouldn't say that I got the ready-made answer, but I got a lot of analytical grid to try to reflect about this experience, to say, well, did it make sense based on the different criteria that you propose for us to reflect on? And I think this brings me to the research policy and practice transfer. I think this is a wonderful way to actually bring a complex topic that is analyzed from an interdisciplinary perspective, from political science, anthropology, and some, political economy, and to say, well, the outcome is highly complex. And by having complex finding, you tend to discourage practitioners. Say, what to do about it? Who cares? I'm on the ground line, no, and this is useless. But I think what you propose is great because it is a grid that is helpful to first think and try to categorize the, for instance, the types of military, the state and non-state armed groups, but also then to raise the right questions. And I think this is really what is most useful as practitioners, is to be able to categorize a bit your thinking and then to raise the right questions. And I would like to conclude by saying that we discussed a lot about experience at field level, but I have the strong impression that the findings are also useful in our humanitarian diplomacy with states, with governments, states signatory to the Geneva Conventions. And I think this gives us also food for thought and for negotiations with regards to issues that pertain to counterterrorism and the limits it puts to in terms of access and doing meaningful work. It also provides us some evidence that is very useful in terms of thinking of our state support initiative when it comes to partnered operations. And I think it's worth pushing also our reflection not only at how it changes the way we engage at field level, but also at a more policy level. So thanks a lot and congratulations for the good work.
Well, thank you, and please join us for a drink.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Helen because we've went through quite a bit and she was fantastic and gave us a lot of mentoring, and also to thank Fiona because she was fantastic to work with.